Hey, good morning. It is so good to see you guys out this morning. I want to give a special welcome to my man Travis Upchurch and his wife Dusty. I saw them sneak in a moment ago. They're missionaries to Taiwan, so we're going to give them the award for like the people that traveled the farthest to be here today. I know we got some people from Clinton County, but I think Taiwan beats you, but good to see you guys. So as we jump in, I want you to try and imagine what life was like 20 years ago. Now, if you're like me, when you hear that phrase 20 years ago, you might think of like the 1980s or maybe like the early 90s. If you do the math, 20 years ago was 2004. Like, as painful as that is to admit. And if you remember, if you're old enough to remember what life was like in 2004, then you know there are a lot of things that are different in 2024. So I was thinking about this recently, and I started making a list. For example, in 2004, the internet was something we used occasionally to kind of periodically check our email. But today, we're almost always online, updating our social media feeds or hitting the like button on our friends' social media feeds. Some of you can remember what this was like. In 2004, it was not unusual if there was a movie coming out that you really wanted to see for you to stand in line waiting to pick up tickets. And then if you couldn't get the tickets and you didn't make it in the theater, you could wait until it came out on DVD and you'd go to Blockbuster and you could rent it and take it to your house and watch it. But today, we don't do any of that. Today, if there's a movie coming out that you really want to watch, almost the day it comes out, you can stream it from your living room, and you don't have to go anywhere. Think about the way that we use our phones. 2004, text messaging was brand new. I looked this up. In 2004, the average cell phone user sent 35 texts a month. In 2024, the average cell phone user sends 85 texts a day. Now think about that. That's why it's become like the predominant mode of communication for a lot of younger people. If you want to talk to somebody under 30 on the phone, if you call them, they're not answering. You send them a text, you're going to get an answer. Think about the other ways we use our phones. Most of us use our phones more to take pictures, send text, DoorDash our meals, and put in our click list than we do having conversation. It's just something that's dramatically changed in 20 years. Something else that's changed. Some of you remember what it was like. In 2004, this started to turn, but some of you remember what it was like to schedule your day around your favorite TV show. Or to listen to the radio like in hopes of hearing your favorite song. But today, you don't do any of that. Today, everything is on demand. You just hit a few buttons and you can watch whatever show you want to watch, and you can listen to whatever song you want to listen to. But for most of us, you think about that, there's been these huge changes, but there have been some other changes that are even more dramatic that have affected all of us in ways we may not even realize. It's not just like how we communicate and how we entertain ourselves. A lot of other things have changed. For one thing, our politics have gotten much more divided. Gender's been redefined. Mass shootings used to be sort of these isolated events. Now they've become sort of routine headlines. Instances of mental illness and depression have skyrocketed. Drug abuse and addiction has continued to grow to the point that it's almost ruined entire communities. So the point is, if a person went to sleep in 2004 and woke up in 2024, it wouldn't take them long to realize they're living in a world that looks much different than the world they fell asleep in. But for most of us, it doesn't feel that dramatic because we've had 2 full decades to sort of adjust to what's felt like gradual change. But I want you to imagine that all of those changes I just described and the ones that you thought about that I didn't mention, instead of happening over a 20-year period, happened literally overnight or maybe over the course of a few days. And while you're thinking about that, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 1. This morning we're launching a new series that's going to take us through most of the summer that we're calling Thriving in Babylon, in which we're going to explore the Old Testament book of Daniel. And just as a disclaimer, as we jump into this, there are two common mistakes that most people make whenever they study the book of Daniel. The first mistake is they read all these cool stories about like Daniel in the lion's den or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in that fiery furnace, and they think that the main point is that we're supposed to be brave like they were brave, and God will protect us like He protected them. The other mistake people make is they start to obsess over all of these different prophecies that are scattered throughout the book, and they try to pinpoint exactly what they mean in hopes of trying to figure out when Jesus is going to return. And while those things are not unimportant, they are not the most important thing that you learn when you read through the book of Daniel. The theme for the book of Daniel, if you're tracking with us, is something you're going to see all throughout the book, and it's this. It's in spite of present appearances, God is in control. In spite of the way it looks at any given moment, in spite of what's going on in your life or in the life of your community, in the life of your country, God is always in control. We're going to come back to that several times throughout the summer, but I want you to get that in your mind. Maybe write it in the margin of your Bible because it's easy to forget. As the book of Daniel opens, the year is 587 BC, and the kingdom of Judah, which included the city of Jerusalem, has just been conquered and ultimately destroyed by a group of people called the Babylonians. I've got a picture that shows you sort of the Babylonian Empire after it conquered the kingdom of Judah, so you can see just how massive, how big this was, one of the great empires the world has ever known. And with that in mind, I want you to listen to the first two verses of Daniel chapter 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So I want you to pay special attention to verse 2, where it says that it was the Lord who delivered Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. To understand what's happening, you have to understand just a little of the backstory. So if you're not a history person, I'll try to make this painless. Essentially what happened was, when the people of Israel, the Jewish people, moved into the promised land, they were a united kingdom. There was one kingdom. And that went on for a long time until eventually they divided up into two distinct kingdoms. So you had the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which included the city of Jerusalem. And that all happened in about 800 BC. And then what happens? You get to 720 BC, and the northern kingdom of Israel is overtaken by a nasty group of people called the Assyrians. So whenever you hear about the Assyrians in the Old Testament, they're kind of like the Nazis of the Old Testament. So they come in, they overrun the northern kingdom of Israel, and they just overtake everything and destroy everything. And the reason that happened is because over time, the people living in the northern kingdom of Israel had drifted further and further away from God until God finally was forced to remove his hand of protection from them. So you would assume that seeing something like that happen to your neighbors to the north would get the attention of the people living in the south. But that's not what happened. Instead, the people living in the southern kingdom of Judah fell into the same downward spiral and slowly drifted further and further from God. And so God saw what was happening. He sent this series of messengers or prophets to get their attention, but they refused to listen. 2 Chronicles 36 explains it this way. It says, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messages again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. And so finally, after repeated attempts to get their attention, God allows the Babylonians to come in and do to the southern kingdom of Judah what the Assyrians had earlier done to the northern kingdom of Israel. So they come in, they capture the city, they destroy Jerusalem, including the temple, which was like the centerpiece to the Jewish religion and the Jewish culture. They then proceeded to kill almost all the inhabitants of the southern kingdom of Judah, except for a very small, select group of people who were forced to relocate from Jerusalem 900 miles away to the city of Babylon, which was the capital city of the Babylonian Empire. Now, if that word sounds familiar, initially in the Old Testament, the first time we're introduced to the name Babylon, it represents the capital city of this Babylonian Empire. But later on, it comes to represent sort of this philosophical system, this way of thinking, this way of life that disregards God's authority and refuses to listen to God's truth. That's why when you get to the book of Revelation, it talks about the defeat of the city of Babylon. It's not talking about an actual geographic location. It's talking about the defeat of this mindset that disregards God's authority. So make sure you catch that. When the biblical writers throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament, when they were looking for a word that they could use to describe the evil of the world system, they chose the name of this ancient city, Babylon. And that's the city where Daniel and his friends, who are a little part of this, like this little group of prisoners of war, are being forced to involuntarily relocate. And they're forced to leave the city of Jerusalem, which was a city of God, and go live in this place that has set itself up against God, or the city of evil. Historians tell us that Daniel was most likely around 15 years old when all of this happened. So it's hard to imagine what this experience would have been like for somebody 15 years old. Almost overnight, his entire life has been upended. The kingdom that he lived in has been defeated. The city that he lived in has been destroyed. The temple where he used to go and worship has now been leveled. The family that raised him by this point has most likely all been murdered. The culture around him has collapsed. And now the life that he thought he was building, the life that he thought he was preparing for, has come to an unexpected end. And now, to make things worse, he's been relocated to a city he never wanted to visit to start with, and enrolled in the Royal Academy of Babylon. The reason for that is because Nebuchadnezzar, the ruthless king of Babylon, has decided that rather than killing everybody, he's going to handpick sort of the cream of the crop. He's going to bring them to Babylon. He's going to enroll them in school where they will be transformed into good Babylonians. And then he will use their gifts to serve his empire after they've gone through this re-education process. And Daniel is a part of that group. Everything in his life has changed. Not over a period of years, but over a period of days. It's as if he went to sleep in one world and he woke up to find himself living in a world that looked nothing like the world he remembered. And waking up from what must have felt like a nightmare, he found himself living in a culture that was determined to make him one of them. That's really what this opening chapter of Daniel is about. See, Babylon was not content to just conquer nations. They wanted to capture hearts. And if you dig into their history, you'll discover that they were really good at it. They had this whole strategy worked out, this whole program they would put people through, not just to conquer their land, but to capture their hearts and try to make them one of them. And so as you explore Daniel's story, there's three parts you see just right off the bat, this strategy that Daniel and his friends had to contend with. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first step in this strategy. It's separation. The very first thing that the Babylonians did after they conquered the land and killed everybody they wanted to kill and handpicked who they wanted to keep is they separated the people whom they allowed to remain alive from everything that was familiar and they took them to a place that was completely unfamiliar to them. They didn't want to risk like leaving them at home and trying to rebuild their kingdom. So they said, we're going to relocate them from what they know, and we're going to put them in a place that's going to be completely disorienting to them because it'll be unlike anything they've ever experienced before. Their ultimate goal was to disconnect them from everything they knew, reconnect them to a new group of people, and immerse them in a new culture. But it wasn't just cultural, it was also religious. See, back in Jerusalem, Daniel and his friends had lived in this environment, as imperfect as it was, where there was always this remnant of people who sort of got it, right? They built their lives around worship of God. Whenever the temple was doing something, whenever there was one of those Jewish festivals, they always stopped what they were doing. And as imperfect and as corrupt as all the corruption that had built up, there was still this group of people who were committed to doing the right thing and trying to honor God with their lives. And Daniel and his little group of friends had been a part of that group. So every time there was a religious festival, everything around them stopped and they put their focus on God. Every time there was a sacrifice to be offered, they had a front row seat. I mean, they were trying their best to do the right thing. But in Babylon, that didn't exist. In Babylon, instead of worshiping one God, they worshiped lots of different gods. And in Babylon, instead of trying to follow, like God's law, it was kind of anything goes. And so they find themselves living in this place that they never wanted to go to begin with. And now they're surrounded by things that they could not have imagined and is entirely self-focused. Now, if any of that is starting to sound familiar, I think you're on to something. Last fall in the Atlantic, there was a writer named Jake Meter. He wrote an interesting article titled "The Misunderstood Reason Millions of Americans Stop Going to Church." I took a snapshot of just the headline if you want to read this later. It's really interesting. So researchers say that we're now living in what's called this time of the great de-churching. Sometimes you'll see the word deconstruction used to describe somebody who's kind of fallen away from their faith or walked away from their faith. And so for years now, researchers have been trying to figure out why is this happening? And they've offered all kinds of reasons, right? The political environment, sexual abuse cases, the corruption within the church, climate change. I've seen that as a possible reason people stop going to church. So you have all of these different reasons researchers have offered. But in his article, Jake Meter did something interesting. Instead of talking to the researchers, he found this group of people who stopped attending church and sort of walked away from their faith. And he asked them, what was the reason? What made you decide to walk away from your faith and sort of deconstruct? And what he discovered in those interviews is that most of them never actually decided. They just sort of drifted. I mean, the vast majority of people, nobody woke up and said, you know what, I think I'm going to lose my faith or deconstruct my faith. Instead, they just sort of drifted. It just sort of happened. Here was the takeaway from the article. He said, the defining problem driving most people who leave is just how American life works in the 21st century. Contemporary America simply isn't set up to promote mutuality, care, or common life. Rather, it is designed to maximize individual accomplishment as defined by professional and financial success. Such a system leaves precious little time or energy for forms of community that don't contribute to one's professional life or, as one gets older, the professional prospects of one's children. And you know what he's saying is true because at some point you've experienced it. And it usually goes something like this. So this weekend, there's a project you have to finish at work. Next weekend, you promised your family you'd take them to the lake. The weekend after that, there's a ball tournament. And then you're going on vacation, which is going to eat up at least 2 weekends. And when you get back from that, there's a concert you want to go to. It's going to keep you out late on Saturday, so you probably sleep in on Sunday. And then you look up, and it's the last weekend before school starts, so you want to take that trip you've been putting off. And then the week after school starts, somebody's got a birthday. And then in 2 weeks, you're 2 weeks into school then, and everybody's got a sinus infection and an ear infection. It's just a whole big thing. And so you look up, and it's been 8 weeks since you've been in worship. and you can't remember the last time you read your Bible or even prayed. It's not like you made some carefully thought out decision to walk away. It just sort of happened. You just sort of drifted. That's the way it works. People start to drift when they give more of themselves to everything else and less of themselves to God. And they begin to separate from everything they know is true. Now here's the second part of the Babylonian strategy, and it's indoctrination. Check out verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Now, keep in mind, they've already picked, like handpicked, the best of the best. Like this is the cream of the crop. These are young guys. They're handsome guys. They have this ability to process information. They're quick studies. I mean, like David and I are probably out. Maybe you can find some people that fit this. But these are the cream of the crop. It says, we're going to put you in school. We're going to enroll you in this royal academy. And for 3 years, we're going to teach you to be a Babylonian. So they receive this graduate level education in language and law and business and economics and history and government and military strategy, political science, and even religion. Today, like we would call this college, right? It works the same way for us. And I'm not anti-college. I went to a lot of schools, so don't think that. But you got to be careful, because here's what happens. We will spend 18 years trying to teach our kids something, and then we'll pay thousands of dollars to enroll them in a school that will tell them everything we taught them is wrong and try to reprogram them. The exact same thing was happening to Daniel and his friends. They go to college, and they start this re-education process. See, the Babylonians had a mold that they wanted everybody to fit into. And they had a clear process for doing what it takes to squeeze them into that mold. Again, same thing is happening today. Whether we realize it or not, our culture has a specific mold that it wants to squeeze us into. Now, for Daniel and his friends, they had to physically relocate to experience this. For us in 2024, we can experience this without ever leaving our houses. It's the movies we watch, the shows we stream, the music we listen to, the books we read, the news channels we turn to, especially the social media accounts that we follow. They all have an agenda that they're pushing in hopes of making us more like them. Scary part is that most of the time we don't even realize it's happening. Now, most of the time we talk about the well-documented dangers of social media. And everybody talk about that, we're usually talking about exposure to pornography or, contact with a child predator. And those things are true. But one of the things a lot of researchers are starting to sound the alarm about is how social media has developed into the most effective indoctrination tool the world has ever known. Like you think about all the indoctrination programs that have gone on in the past, that is nothing compared to what's happening today. One researcher wrote this. He said, social media platforms have evolved into powerful tools of emotional indoctrination. Through carefully designed algorithms and targeted content creators are able to manipulate our emotions, shaping our attitudes and beliefs without us even realizing. Does that ever happen to you? You ever found yourself going down a rabbit hole you didn't even know existed? How about this? You ever found yourself getting anxious and upset about stuff that didn't have anything to do with you because you saw it online? She goes on, she says, the constant barrage of information can create an echo chamber where our views are reinforced while opposing opinions are silenced. This reinforcement can lead to a distorted perception of reality and a lack of critical thinking. Just in case you're wondering. That's the world we live in 2024. When you get to verse 6, Daniel tells us just how far they were willing to go to sort of reprogram these people. Verse 6 says, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names to Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. What's interesting about this, if you go back and you look at the etymology of their Hebrew names, you'll discover that there was a reference to Israel's God in each of those names. But by renaming them, they eliminated that reference and they put in a new reference to one of the Babylonian gods. It's part of this, we'll give you a new name in hopes of shaping you into a new person, giving you a new identity. It's all part of this indoctrination process. And then the last thing, this last part of the strategy, though, you see, is this what we call incentivization. That's what I had trouble saying that all week, but hopefully you get the point. Incentivization. If you go back to verse 5, as part of their program, Nebuchadnezzar goes to these guys. He says, here's what we're going to do. Since you're enrolled in this special program, I'm going to feed you from my table. Make sure you don't miss the significance of that, because in a kingdom like Babylon, who eats the best food and drinks the best wine? It's the king, right? Like, even if everybody else in the whole kingdom is starving, the king is going to have the best of everything. So as a part of this deal, he says to his servants, I want you to feed these guys the same stuff that you're feeding me. And when you get to verse 8, things get a little bit complicated, because Daniel speaks up, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Now, there's some questions people have about why doesn't Daniel just eat the food? Like, it doesn't seem like that would be that big of a deal. But historians say that maybe the reason is that oftentimes in these ancient kingdoms, before the food would be brought to the king's table, they would use that food in their pagan offerings as they worshiped idols. So they would first offer the food to an idol. If the idol didn't eat it, it would then be brought to the king. And so Daniel, by saying he doesn't want to be contaminated by anything that's been offered to idols, he's setting up this showdown with Nebuchadnezzar. And the servant, Ashpenaz, he knows he's got to do something. He's sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. He works for Nebuchadnezzar, and he knows that if Daniel and his friends start to appear malnourished, it'll be him that pays the cost. And so you get to verse 11, Daniel sort of negotiates this deal. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Make sure you understand this. By even suggesting this, much less following through with this, Daniel's taking his life in his hands. He's already been exiled. All of his family's already been killed. And now he's saying, hey, instead of following like the king's orders, let's do a little experiment. And if it goes wrong, guess what's going to happen? He's going to be executed too, along with the servant of the king. And so the question is, why didn't he just eat the food? I mean, again, it doesn't seem like it would be that big of a deal. Sometimes, you just got to go along to get along. And it might not be the best thing, but in the overall scheme of things, not that big a deal. So you try and put yourself in his shoes. I mean, all he has to do is just eat this food to secure his future. He has to compromise what he believes to be true in this moment to reserve his spot at the king's table and secure his future. Some of you know what that feels like, because at different points in your life, you found yourself in a similar situation. Maybe you worked for a company and they asked you to promote a cause or adopt a position that collided with what you believe. Or maybe you found yourself working in an environment which corners were often cut and customers were routinely lied to, and the unspoken rule was you just make as much money as you possibly can for the company and don't worry too much about things like honesty and integrity. Or maybe instead of being asked just to tolerate certain things, you were pressured to celebrate things that deep down inside you believe are wrong. And when you tried to respectfully communicate where you stood, your bosses made it clear that unless you get with the program, your future doesn't look too bright, right? No perks, no promotions, no extra vacation days, no raises. And besides, you looked around and nobody else was making a big deal out of it. None of your coworkers seemed to be all that concerned about it. So why are you concerned about it? Some of you know what it's like to live with that kind of pressure. Others of you may be living with that now. That's where Daniel was. But rather than compromising his beliefs, he decided to stand on the courage of his convictions. And look how it turned out, verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Most of us, we remember Daniel's story. And we always think about the highlight reels that come later, right? We know about the lion's den. If you were to make a highlight clip, Daniel would be in a lot of different clips. But what I want to make sure you understand is that all of the stuff that comes later that you remember about Daniel started with this. Here's the big idea for today. Small decisions lead to big victories. See, most of the time, we like to think in terms of big victories. We all want to be the hero of the story. We all want to experience our own highlight moments, like where we took a stand and we said the right thing and we stood our ground in spite of the pressure. But the truth is that those big victories almost always come on the heels of a lot of small decisions that are made when nobody else is looking. Because here's the thing. You look at Daniel's situation, most people had no idea this was even going on. The only people that knew were the people that were directly involved. It's not like he planned a protest march. He didn't file a lawsuit. He didn't get on social media and complain about, how unjust all this is. He quietly and calmly made a decision to refuse to compromise his beliefs in the face of immense pressure to secure his own future. And the cool thing is that one small decision ignited a chain reaction of events that ended in a lot of big victories. Now, I want you to stand with me. The band's going to come. And I don't have to convince you that we live in a world that is much different than the world most of us grew up in. You think about everything that's happened over the last 20, 40, 60 years, it almost leaves you breathless. It's like we were born into one world, and now we live in a world that looks much different, and we live with this unrelenting pressure to fit in. We're surrounded by a culture that will do everything it takes. They'll try to separate us from what we know. They'll try to indoctrinate us in what they believe. They'll try to incentivize us to accept what they believe. And so we're always under this pressure. I want you to know that all of the big victories start with small decisions not to cave to the pressure around you. That's how it works. That's how it worked for Daniel. That's how it'll work for us. So if you're here this morning and you've never made the first big decision, I want to encourage you to do that. If you're here you're ready to put your trust in Christ, ready to be baptized into Christ, ready to pray with someone, David and I would love to do that for you. Or maybe you're here and you just feel that pressure that we talked about that Daniel was under, and you just need to spend some time praying quietly that God will give you the strength to do what you need to do and not do what you know you don't need to do. And I hope you'll use this time to do that. We're going to sing. If you need to make a decision publicly or talk to somebody, we pray.